I'm really excited to be here because Edulastic, I think, is one of those. It was a free tool that I discovered as a teacher that really just changed my teaching. And it's one of those free tools that has other teacher resources on it, and I will shamelessly steal anything from any teacher as long as you're putting it out there. So one of the things that I love about Edulastic is that teachers have uploaded tests and quizzes. If I am stuck on something, if I am teaching a book and I just want to give some basic comprehension tests or quizzes, it's really easy for me to do that. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you can use Edulastic in your classroom to target the standards and how you can look at data to target your standards. Edulastic is perfect for the shift in the standards. And before we taught with the standards, it was a very like, oh, how does the text relate to yourself? And how does the text relate to the outside world? And now that we have more guidance in our classrooms for how to teach the standards, we also have to figure out how to test the standards. And so I took a little blurb from the Student Achievement Partners about college and career ready standards. And in the bold print on the screen that you could read on your own, I'll read it to you, but in the bold print, this is what Edulastic allows you to do and how to assess the standards. And so we have all these really great standards that let us hit our students with things that they're going to need for the real world. But the problem comes when you have to test them. And how can you test these standards? Because it's so much more stressful for our students, I think. With Common Core, it's good, but it's harder to integrate that into the classroom. And then it not only was a shift for our students, but it's a shift for us as teachers too. So the college and career ready standards place a premium on students writing to sources, and using evidence from text to present clear full analyses, well-developed claims, and clear information. And rather than asking students questions that they can answer solely from their prior knowledge or experience, the standards expect students to answer questions that depend on him having read the text or texts with care. And as Jan pointed out, the passage-based sets, the enhanced ELA items help with that. The standards also require the cultivation of narrative writing throughout the grades. In later grades, a command of sequence and detail will be essential for effective argumentative and informational writing. And Edulastic addresses that with rubrics and with the constructed response items. And likewise, the reading standards focus on students' ability to read carefully and grasp information, arguments, ideas, and details based on text evidence. Students should be able to answer a range of text-dependent questions in which the answers require inferences based on careful attention to the text. And those are those Part A, Part B questions. And I know that once PARC came out, and when I lived in Louisiana for a while, and so we had LEAP, and all of our, like every principal that I've ever worked for is like, well, we need those Part A, Part B questions. Like you need to be hitting your kids with those Part A, Part B questions every day. And you can do it on paper, that's cool, but Edulastic does it so quickly for you. And with the tech enhanced items, you can do the Part A, Part B and have all of that data right there in front of you. And you can tag multiple standards. So you can tag that, the reading standard, like the one standard where they're collecting the knowledge or they're collecting the text evidence, and then you can tag it along with the standard that the question's actually testing, which is great. The Part A, Part B questions, I think that those are the ones that are the hardest for teachers to write, and I love that Edulastic has a database full of those questions. So these are some of the questions the tech enhanced questions that can address the standards really well. So things like the passage based, and that's where you can upload the passage so that, and I usually let students use a textbook. If we've been reading the book in class, like I let them hold the text in their hands, but I try to have, if it's a passage, I also try to have it in the platform as well. Sentence response, same thing, like they're able to look at these passage-based questions and then answer the question based on the text and use evidence. The multi-part questions, those are those Part A, Part B questions that I know all of your principals have been saying, have you been doing those Part A, Part B questions in class? And then the resequence questions, I've seen this on PARC tests and I've seen it on other state tests where they have to reorder events to put in an objective summary. And so that one's really helpful with that. I didn't star the drag and drop, but the drag and drop also works for the PARC style questions or the Common Core style questions where they can sort information. And And the great thing about this too, like one of my kids said the other day, like, "Ooh, I love Edulastic." And I was like, well, that's kind of a nerdy thing to say. Like, why do you love Edulastic? He's like, well, it reminds me of state testing. And I'm like, okay, so you like to test? He's like, no, but when I take the test, I feel comfortable and I don't freak out. And so that's one of the best things I think about Edulastic is that they have these in tech enhanced items. And I know that our district uses a platform that doesn't have these tech enhanced pieces. And so anytime we want to address something like that, we're doing it on paper in the class, or we don't have part A, part B questions in our testing platform, and they can't do resequencing in our platform. And so the kids don't get practice with it. And the first time they see it is on their state test. And that's, that I can see where that would stress them out. So I love that I'm able to get my kids comfortable with that. And I'm sure that they don't love the quizzing part of it, but they like the part where they can get comfortable with it. All right, so then the classic question types that Jan was talking about, like multiple choice, multiple selection, essay type, all of these are also available for those Part A, Part B questions. So when you're designing a Part A, Part B question, you're able to put in widgets. So I can put a multiple choice for Part A and multiple select for Part B. Or I can do multiple choice for Part A and sentence select for Part B, where they're choosing a sentence out of a paragraph. Or I can do text drop down in Part A, and I can do multiple choice in Part B. And so that also prepares them. It gets them thinking in different ways, and it gets them to analyze the text in different ways while they're actually taking the test. And Susie just asked, can we see a sample of these? Susie, I'm going to show you some data in a few minutes, and it'll show you an example of the Part A, Part B questions. So Common Core asks you to look at, let me see, Common Core asks you to look at literacy in a lot of different ways. And the way that I like to think with these, and that I was taught that these components of literacy work, is that they're like cogs in a machine, and they're all interdependent on each other. So like, for example, we have fluency right in the middle, and if a kid isn't fluent, they're not going to be able to read complex text, they're not going to do close reading, they're not going to be able to do to finish off the volume of reading that's required for them to move on to different reading levels, and evidence-based writing is going to be very hard for them. And so Edulastic obviously can't address all of these different cogs of literacy, but it can address 5 specific ones really well. In the academic language and academic vocabulary. So whenever I'm writing a question stem in Edulastic, I always make sure that it mimics the standard. And I make sure that the language of the standard is in the question, because the state tests are going to have the language of the standard in the question. And a lot of teachers like to dumb down the standards and put it in like student-friendly language, but that's not going to be helpful for your students then when they come across it later. So my tests in Edulastic are a little harder because I use that academic language, but they've seen it so many times. Like, we take at least 1 quiz a week, and they've seen it so many times that it's fine. They're used to it. They don't freak out when they see it anymore. And the same thing with academic vocabulary. With the passage-based tests and with the Part A, Part B questions, I'm able to test their vocabulary not just on what they're remembering from class, but I'm able to test them based on what they're able to infer from the text. And that's helpful, and it's helped my students with their reading levels a lot too, because they don't get as tripped up or worried about words. They're able to go back. Like, they know that my expectation of them is that on a quiz, they're going to have to be able to use context clues to determine the meaning of a word. So they do it now while they're reading. It doesn't scare them anymore. The passage-based questions allow us to test that complex text and make sure that those tests are right. And there are a ton of tests already on Edulastic that have been put there by teachers. And Edulastic has a great new feature that's the Edulastic promoted items. I forget what it's called, but these complex texts are there, and you're able to just pull from resources that are already out there, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The Edulastic does do close reading with the passage set questions, and then the evidence-based writing. And with the evidence-based writing, there's rubrics that you can use to grade and score your writing, which is very helpful, because I pull the rubrics that are on the state test and I put them into my Edulastic, and that's how I grade my students, so that by the time the state test comes, they're very comfortable with that rubric. And I realize that I'm saying state test, state test, state test, and I am not teaching to the test. but I'm teaching so that my students are comfortable when the test comes. I'm still teaching them everything that they need to know. I mean, the rubric that's on the state test is based on writing, and they need to know how to write argument pieces, and they need to know how to write informational pieces, and the passage-based questions help them to do that. So the way that I outline my my item sets. So say that I've decided I'm a teacher and I'm going to put a passage item set on and make an item set test for it. And it's a cold read test. My students have never seen the passage before. And so I took this from the Louisiana Believes website. I find that it's really easy to do item sets if I have this tool in front of me. And this is called the Reader Circles. And what I'm doing is I'm asking them questions that start with observation questions and go up to analysis questions. And I'm not going to start with a theme question or a purpose question, because that's a higher level of thinking. So I want to make sure that I'm asking those questions later and that I'm leading my questions up to that. So I'm going to ask questions about the author's craft and elements and structure before I even get to literary effects and meaning. And so a nice example of this is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. And I am a whole to part thinker, which means that I can tell you what the theme is of that story after reading it, but I probably can't tell you how I got there. But most of my students are part to whole thinkers, which means that they can't tell me the theme, but they can get there gradually. And so The Telltale Heart, if I start with word choice and connotation and ask them a question about the reader's or the author's craft, and they're able to pull out that word choice and get that and answer that question successfully and feel successful on that, then if I lead into a question about tone, they're going to feel a little bit more comfortable with tone. And the word choice directly affects tone. And then the tone is going to directly affect the irony in the story, and that's where we're going to get the theme of, you know, the narrator and how he was so nervous. So this is the way that I structure the item sets that I'm putting into Edulastic. But this is also the way that I'm going to look at my data when it comes back from Edulastic. So I love everything Edulastic, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a panelist on this webinar. Like, I offered to be a panelist because I love everything Edulastic. But one of the best things about Edulastic is that I can look at these questions, and Edulastic's going to break it down for me. If I click on the question analysis report, I'm able to see which questions my students struggled with right away. And they show me this graph here. So I can see right away that when we read the Of Mice and Men and the kids took the chapter 3 quiz, that question 6 threw over half of my kids. And actually 48% isn't a bad number for a test. So we have that 48% of our kids that didn't do very well on it. So I know that the 48% is bad, but if I look down at the bottom of the screen and I see that the question 6 is what they got wrong, I can also see where the standards are tagged. And it was standard 1 and standard 3 for grades 9 to 10. ELA, reading literature. And so I've been in PLCs where I have instructional coaches and principals and assistant principals coming in and telling us, like, what standards did your kids do poorly on? How are you going to reteach that standard? And that's not how we can look. We can't look at ELA like that. Like, I can't go back to my kids and say, oh, standard 3, we're going to reteach characterization, because I don't know if that's what trips them up on it. So the greatest thing about Edulastic is that bottom red arrow where it's pointing to question 6, I can click on that question 6. And so when I click on the question 6, not only do I see the question, and this is, Susie, this is what I was talking about when I'm able to show you the part A, part B questions. This was a part A with a multiple choice and a part B with a multiple select. And the question was, what does the shooting of Candy's dog most reveal about Carlson and the other men on the ranch? I'm able to scroll through and see what all of my kids answered on this question, so that I can see that when the correct answer was supposed to be they see weakness as a threat and something that needs to be removed. Well, that's kind of more of a theme question. It is a character stem, but the answer choice is what was tripping them up. Like, they understood how the characters acted, but they weren't able to connect it to a theme. And so this student put that they're selfish and looking out for themselves. And I can see where there was some misconceptions in selecting the evidence, but if the part A was incorrect, then the part B was probably incorrect too. It can also show me for different types of misconceptions. So this student, I can see that part A, they missed it, but part B, they didn't even select the 2 pieces of evidence. So for this student, I know that I need to go back and trust me, this wasn't the only student, but I need to go back and make sure that they're reading the stems correctly and reading them carefully. And when it says 2 pieces of evidence, that they're able to select the 2 pieces of evidence. I always make sure too that I bold things like that in my question stem, and Edulastic lets you do that. They let you put in pictures, they let you bold, italicize, change the fonts. So it's a good tool where you can help students go in the correct direction. The student didn't, but I'm able to address that now in my classroom because I saw where that misconception was. I didn't just see that the student missed standard 3. Like, the student missed a lot more than standard 3. They're missing the stems of the question. So with that, I know that instead of characterization, when I'm focusing on reteaching for the kids that missed this, I'm not going to focus on characterization. Instead, it was the details and the literary devices that got them to characterization. That's where they lost the characterization. They weren't able to make inferences about the characters because they didn't completely understand the details and the literary devices and how those 2 things worked together. So I'm able to go back to my reader circles and really look at the way that the question was structured, but also the way that their thinking is structured from that observation to analysis piece. And the analysis piece is usually where a lot of my constructed response questions come from. So that is how I develop item sets and how my PLC looks at data from the item sets.